Thank you very much, Dr. Galal, and it's a pleasure for me to be here in this very important initiative of the Economic Research Forum and IDRC. I am deeply honored to be invited, and I would like, therefore, to thank the organizers of this conference. First, let me start my talk by introducing you to Lucia, a second grader in Santa Maria, Guatemala, and her classmates. This photo was taken by my daughter when she was a World Vision volunteer teacher in Guatemala several years ago. Her experience and her stories about Lucia and her family and house and her community made me think about gender inequality and the challenges ahead in a sort of very profound ways. Lucia, you see, is one of the many indigenas or indigenous population that make up more than 61% of Guatemala's population. According to the International Working Group of Indigenous Affairs, Lucia and her family are 2.8 times poorer and have 13 years less life expectancy than an ordinary non-indigenous Guatemalan. Where is she now, and what shapes her identity? It is shaped by social expectations of her ethnic group, Ixil, and of the Guatemalan society at large. Her aspirations and opportunities open to her as part of the minority group who are overwhelmingly poor and historically as well as currently discriminated against is shaped by economic policies. By identity, of course, I refer to a person's recognized social position within society and the way that person defines who she or he is and her or his relationship with others. That identity of Lucia and of each one of us here is shaped by many factors, by her gender, by her ethnicity, by her location, living in the rural village outside Antigua, her citizenship, being part of the Guatemalan society, her culture, and of course, her economic status. You see, Guatemala is a country where women do not participate widely in decision-making processes and have limited economic opportunities. This is true for both Lucia, who's a minority, considered a minority in her country, as well as the non-indigenous or majority of the population. Moreover, structural violence against women in that country persists. The institutions devoted to women's empowerment have historically had limited capacity for implementation and monitoring of existing gender policies. But that is slowly changing as women's groups, as well as donors and international organizations, continue to push for change alongside other grassroots organizations. Much progress has been achieved in Guatemala and elsewhere since the Beijing Platform for Action was launched in 1995. For example, more girls are enrolling in school and more women are working, getting elected, and assuming leadership positions. And the global consensus on the need to achieve gender equality seems stronger than ever. There have been significant achievements indeed. For example, regarding laws on property rights and inheritance, gender equality in property ownership have made headways, except for some parts of the world, including the Middle East and North Africa region and South Asia region. Some of the other inequalities and forms of inequalities that I think our speakers for the rest of the day and tomorrow will be speaking about are somewhat captured by this simple gender inequality indicator, which measures gender inequalities in three important aspects of human development: reproductive health, empowerment, and economic status. The gender inequality indicators and other indicators that have come since show or yield insights on gender gaps in major areas of human development that are measurable. There are other aspects or spheres of women's lives not captured by standard gender inequality indicators that continue to be problematic, such as violence against women. I show here data collected using the OECD 2030, WHO 2013 global and regional estimates of violence against women. And we see the persistence or lifetime prevalence of intimate private partner violence among ever-partnered women across the globe, including developed countries. In this slide, I show here the percentage of unpaid care and household work performed by women by country and region. Unpaid work data is limited, unfortunately, in the MENA, to my knowledge, and thus are not included in this graph. But as you can see, whether it be in the case of the developed countries, anywhere from Belgium, Canada, Finland, Germany, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and United States, to countries in Africa, including South Africa, Tanzania, and Asia, including Cambodia, India, Pakistan, and Korea, women do overwhelmingly the household work that remain invisible to many policymakers. Gender, as I see it, and I'm sure many others in this audience shared this view, is embedded in institutions, structures, and processes. I provide here some of the categories of these structures and institutions. Households, where gender norms and stereotypes are continually played on. Educational system and curriculum materials that can perpetuate gender norms and as well as unequal access to opportunities after schooling. Markets and economic processes. Gender relations permeate these institutions, such as hiring, promotion, and wage earnings in the labor market, true for land as well as for credit. Economic processes are non-linear, as we know, and can influence gender in varied and sometimes unexpected ways. For example, export promotion and industrializations have shown the rise of female share of employment, so-called feminization, but defeminization of industrial labor has also reappeared in contexts where industrial upgrading took place or there was a large inflow of low-wage male labor, leading to a decrease in the proportion of women, such as in the case of Mexico's maquiladora industry, or in Korea, or in Turkey, or in Taiwan export sector. Such trends that are non-linear and nuanced make us vigilant and continue and require us to continue our research on this subject. Another important sphere of life and an institution in which gender is embedded is religion and culture. They can uphold patriarchal views and male authority, control and power in decision-making. They help the internalization of gender norms among women and men, shaping their identity, choices, and their aspirations. For example, a key roadblock to implementing the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, as we call it, is the persistent patriarchal values and norms that permeate political, religious, and social life. As with any example of the legal approach towards social change, whether it be affirmative action in the case of the United States, for example, or granting women the right to own land, as in the case of Ethiopia recently, in order to attain significant progress towards gender equality, a critical mass in a society, both men and women, has to embrace those ideals underlying the laws. Therefore, critical to making CEDAW's principles of equality a reality is to promote creative and effective forms of consciousness raising, which entails making sure that women and men, even in the remote areas where Lucia lives, become aware of their rights and of their being equal. Why does gender inequality remain so persistent despite much progress and many international conventions and commitments reached? That's a hard question to answer. But I summarize some of my views in this slide. Has to do with patriarchy. It has to do with the fact that gender inequality is interconnected with other persistent inequalities, such as ethnicity, race, and class. And also the fact that gender, as with other social constructs, can be used as an instrument for maintaining privilege, control, and power. We need to understand how different institutions and structures that I showed in the previous slide can be used to maintain gender inequality and make this as a means to as an instrument of control in the hands of the powerful and status quo. I cite an example of my country, the Philippines, for example, where Catholicism has been used in the Philippines for more than 3 centuries to keep women subordinate and submissive, as codified in the Spanish Civil Code that did not get substantially modified until the 1970s, and also the Code of Commerce. I also cite neoliberal models, knowledge and theories, such as the Becker model of the household, which can be used as a framework and a justification for maintaining so-called comparative advantage of women and men, thereby upholding social norms that undermines women's voice and impede their progress. This is also true for authoritarian regimes that can make use of gender in keeping half of the population silent. Now I move on to the next story. This is the story of Rani, a woman that I have never met, but whose story has been told at the IAFE conference in Buenos Aires in 2010, a year after the global financial crisis, and countries like Argentina and the United States are still trying to recover from the aftermath. Rani is a 42-year-old woman in South India. She used to work in a small factory making handcrafted dolls for export for several years before 2009. By 2011, Rani is working as a daily house cleaner, earning 1,000 rupees a month. Before the decline in her earnings, what depresses Rani is her shift from a stable factory job to the status of a casual worker cleaning different houses. To Rani, America and recession were meaningless words. She doesn't understand why her job disappeared so suddenly. Explanation of the global financial crisis by the media, by economists, by many panels, brings only an exasperated query from her. But why should something that happens 10,000 miles away affect me? She's joined by many other women who have suffered seen their jobs move from stable, permanent jobs to increasing precarious types or forms of employment. Here's some data from the World Development Indicators in terms of the share of female employment that are considered vulnerable jobs. And as we can see, I show here some of the MENA countries, regions, and you can see some diversity in terms, at least, of vulnerable employment as a proportion of female employment in the region. Okay, it can be as high as 68% in Morocco, to as low as 5 and even 3% to Jordan and Kuwait. I think there will be discussions on labor markets later, and I think some of these explanations will bring more light to this slide. But let me move now to globalization. See, Rani experienced globalization deep down and personal. She lost her means of livelihood, increased her dependency on her husband and her husband's family, and made her work longer hours. But globalization is not a linear process. It is uneven. It affects countries in varied ways, and the integration of some economies in the world are less to some degree compared to others. We need to discuss globalization in in the context of the diversity of the setting in which it happened. But there are some general aspects of globalization that we can say. Okay, globalization has to do with the laws of motion set by capital accumulation, at least the modern economic globalization that I'm talking about. Okay. It has brought about or facilitated by the rise and consolidation of neoliberalism, okay, and has brought forward increasing commercialization and financialization, but as well as concentration of wealth and increasing proletarianization. Globalization has been accompanied by triumphalist affirmation of neoliberalism that continue to emphasize the norms and behavior associated with economic rationality. Thus, we have witnessed this affirmation in various forms, ranging from strong emphasis in productivity, efficiency, financial returns, commercialization, consumerism, and an apparent tolerance for and even acceptance of social inequalities and greed. Thus, the world is both wealthier, at the same time more unequal today than at any point since World War II. The richest 1% of the world's population now owns about 40% of the world's assets, while the bottom half owns no more than 1%. Now, here comes another difficult task. How does one analyze the impact of globalization on gender inequality? An analysis of impacts of globalization on women's lives does not allow for any easy generalizations either. It's difficult to reach general conclusions on whether globalization intensifies women's work or has liberating effect on gender inequality, or weakened it, weakened patriarchal control. These questions require a contextual analysis of the nature of the development process and the particular set of institutions, structures, and processes in which unequal gender relations permeate. For example, is paid employment empowering and liberating for women, or does it intensifies and weakens, intensifies patriarchal control? The answer is it can be, but employment is sometimes disempowering and exploitative of women. Paid employment for women is no panacea, either for women themselves or for society in general. The nature of the work and the ability to advance within the jobs are also important factors. Women in many parts of the world are often exploited by their employers, including migrant domestic workers, and oftentimes by their own family members, where they are used as unpaid family labor in men's farms or enterprises. In Egypt, according to the study by Assad and Al-Hamidi, women's employment drops as soon as they enter marriage and their childbearing years. In Iran, married women have the lowest rate of participation compared to single and widowed women. But the widening income and wealth disparities is also reflected in the increasing differentiation of women. For example, this has created diverse types of care arrangements and have shifted the distribution of caregivers across social classes and even national boundaries. For instance, hiring domestic workers or paid caregivers, for example in my country, is a common solution for middle and upper income families. The need for work-life balance is therefore mediated by the seemingly abundant supply of women coming in the rural areas, in the case of the Philippines, willing to work for low wages. But for women in poor households, however, hiring domestic help is simply unaffordable, and these households are often compelled to engage their children and daughters, particularly, in domestic work to enable the family to meet its survival needs. Sometimes the women migrate abroad and serve in other families and care for other children in order for her to help support her own children. But these trends, such as pulling girls out of school to care for younger children and to accomplish domestic tasks, enable the persistence of gender inequalities in future generations. If we think we have some challenges ahead, wait to hear more about what we are facing. Here's a picture of women and men in Tacloban City, Leyte, in my country, the Philippines, in the aftermath of the super typhoon Haiyan, apparently the strongest typhoon ever on record that occurred in 2013. My niece, who is a doctor in the Philippine General Hospital, was one of the first to come to the aid in Leyte and saw the havoc and the vulnerability of everyone, rich and poor alike, men, women, and children. And she told me some harrowing stories. Unfortunately, such climate change and environmental and natural disasters are not uncommon, and they're likely to increase with climate change. In addition to that, we have rising inequality. Also, we are quite good in creating more conflicts. We are also caught up in ever accumulation of wealth and ever increasing consumption. And we remain feeble in addressing climate change and environmental degradation. So the world faces serious challenges today that go beyond the financial crisis. These concerns have to do with all of the things I have mentioned above, and will require more of us to be creative in our thinking and in our endeavor to address gender inequality in the context of all these challenges. Moving on, I just want to mention that one of the most vulnerable areas of the world to climate change is the MENA region. In fact, yesterday, I read in the newspaper about Ethiopia facing the severest drought in this decade. And many humanitarian agencies are preparing themselves both for more conflict over water resource, as well as more conflict in terms of war, as well addressing the hunger that is likely to occur as many crops of the 80% of the population who rely on agriculture, say in countries like Ethiopia, have withered and died. So climate change is likely to make this water situation even more critical. And there will be more areas that will be prone to drought, as well as humid and wetter regions more prone to flooding worldwide. So these are some of the challenges that we face. So I would like to end my talk by providing a few lessons from our own journey towards integrating gender in development. Okay. There are 3 lessons I would summarize from our journey, and I'll give an example to illustrate it. First, we need to rethink development paradigm and strategies. As we see today, that it's not just about addressing gender equality, promoting gender equality and human development, but we need to promote human development and gender equality in the context of environmental sustainability. We need to think of the women and men and girls today as much as we need to think about women and girls and boys and men of tomorrow. This will require us to build bridges, to get out of our so-called silos in the way we do our thinking, in the way we come up with policies and strategies. It will require us, and I speak as an economist, to think beyond the so-called virtues of competition, but towards cooperation and building collective action. And as I will show in the next few slides, it will require such transformative change requires social movements. By way of illustration, I'd like to mention an interesting project, so-called Accounting for Women's Work. You see, this story is around a simple vision of making women's work and all forms of unpaid work more visible. But I'd like to show you in the next few slides what it takes for such a vision to materialize. First, this Accounting for Women's project is really a collective endeavor of scholars, of feminists, women's groups, the United Nations, donors, international institutions, and some governments. The key objective is to obtain a full account of women's contribution to human welfare, and that includes unpaid care work. Now, it's a simple but difficult challenge because there has been a historical systematic bias against unremunerated or unpaid work. For example, ever since 1954, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians have explicitly excluded unpaid work from the concept of work. Work simply means for profit or for pay. And therefore, since the 1950s, it's been invisible in labor force data and other types of statistics. 1993, moving on forward, there has been some unpaid work officially acknowledged and added to the system of national accounts. But that said, much of unpaid work remains unaccounted for and outside SNA, and that includes household and care work. Another improvement or another area of progress is in the improvement in data collection, such as time use survey data that enable us to capture how much do men and women spend in different types of activities during the day, whether it be subsistence production, backyard gardening, household work, care for the sick, elderly, and children, and so forth. This idea of measuring, coming up with a number to account for the unpaid women's work has been quite transformative. It has made a broader impact that transcends the initial concerns raised by feminists. It challenged, for example, our idea of labor, challenges the biases in output, GDP, and labor force statistics. It brought about criticisms on the underlying conceptual and methodological concerns regarding unpaid work. It exposes the biases embedded in conventional macro, and micro models, economic models and analysis. And it has helped promote the care agenda in the context of sustainable human development. Here's some example of what has been accomplished since then. Here's some data on the estimated value of household production, so-called satellite account to SNA, for various countries that have collected time-use data and have used that to measure the size of the household production as a proportion of GDP. In Finland, it's 33% of GDP. In Australia, it's 48% of nearly 44% of GDP. We need to do that for the developing countries, and my suspicion is that it can be larger than these numbers. Also, it has made progress in coming up with policy involving care. For example, in Colombia, in 2010, there was the passage of the national law called 1413, requiring the government to measure the contributions of women to the economic and social development of the country and to serve as fundamental tool for the design and implementation of public policies. It is a law, and therefore all agencies, whether it be Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Labor, not just the Ministry of Women's Affairs, are involved and engaged in the care economy. Finally, in 2013, reform has taken place at the global level. 1954, the ICLS, International Conference of Labor Statisticians, has declared work to be only for profit and for pay, for pay. In 2013, the resolution redefines the concept of work and provides a framework for their measurement, identifying 5 types of work that are done by persons over 15 years of age. Unpaid on-production work, employment work, which is only one of the 5 categories, unpaid trainee work, unpaid volunteer work, and other types of unpaid work done by prisoners, by the military, and so forth. So what does it take to bring gender equality in this region? It has, first of all, I say that the struggle for gender equality is a shared task. It requires the collective effort to bring about governance reforms to tackle inequality and injustice, not just on the basis of gender, but in all its forms. It requires cooperation and coalition of work of scholars, many of you here, donors, international organizations, environmentalists, grassroots community organizations. It is a work that requires all of our efforts. That's the only way we can make words into deeds. Thank you.